Okay, we're avocado growers and we get things done on time, right? So it's 1 o'clock and we're going to be talking about pollinators, pollinizers, what is pollination, and how do you spell pollinizer? This is the California Avocado Society meeting. It's sponsored by Brocon Nursery, Delray Avocado, Index Fresh, Ag West, Westphalia Fruit, Colabo, American Credit, McDaniel Fruit, and United Water, who provide this great room where we have these huge numbers of avocado growers present to hear this presentation. And then the rest of you will be on Zoom. And the other sponsors are the California Avocado Commission and University of California. There'll be some controversial things said here, and I hope you find that fun. And our first speaker is Mary Lou Arpaia from University of California at Riverside. And she is the oldest person in the department, the botany department at UC Riverside. And she is hiding right now. Where'd she go? Anyway, I've known Mary Lou since we were in graduate school together at UC Davis. And she has probably done more for the avocado industry and research than anyone else in the University of California. And she's brought along a lot of people, taught them what she knows and let them go about their own ways. So Mary Lou has been working on avocado pollination now for, boy, I don't know how long, certainly for about 30 years. So Mary Lou, are you about ready? Are ready, so take it away.
So good afternoon, everybody. I'm not going to talk for very long, but I'm going to give an introduction into flowering and review of avocado flowering behavior. So we'll move on. So avocado flowering characteristics, which make the avocado tree sort of an interesting tree. It's a challenge to growers because of its flowering behavior. And then, so we'll go through that. So the first thing is the avocado comes from a very primitive plant family in what they call the flowering plants, the angiosperms. And it's believed by a lot of ecologists that because the tree produces this huge amount of flowers, that the tree itself acts like a big flower because you have a lot of little tiny flowers and masses of flowers. And so the traction, it's believed that the whole tree acts like a giant inflorescence. But more important for a grower, that's a challenge for us growing avocados, is that it has a very small fertilization percentage. So most flowers do not set fruit. And that's just a matter of the nature of the tree because it's producing thousands and thousands of flowers on the tree. The other thing that makes avocados difficult if you want to grow the fruit is that there is a competition between the fruit and vegetative growth, and as well as between other fruits. So this leads to a high rate of primary fruit abscission, which you see when you go out in your grove. You think you have a wonderful fruit set, and you come out and you see all this fruit on the ground. And then the final thing that makes things difficult in terms of flowering and fruit set of avocados is they have this thing called synchronous dichogamy, and I'll define that for you in a few minutes. So there's many processes involved when the tree flowers. We have flower induction. We're not talking about flower induction now. That's sort of a controversial topic. We know that there's a small protein called FT, that's the flowering protein, the magic flowering inducer. And that is one of the main triggers for flowering. It can be induced by cold weather, but it can also is known that FT can be induced by many other factors. But flowering and fruit set, that's what we're here about today. So we have the process of pollinization and fertilization, which I'll define here in a few minutes for you. We have the timing of the female and male flower phases. We have then the pollinator activity. So the pollinator is the vector that moves the pollen around. And we have the presence of pollinizers, which is the pollen donor to the opposite flower type. And then we have environmental conditions. And typically Like this morning, Marllon and I were out in the field and it's raining, it's chilly. And we went out to a hass grove and the trees had flowers on them. They were open. Were they female? No, they were male. Against the paradigm, but they're responding to the environmental cues that they're getting about how they flower. And not much is understood about how avocado flowering really responds to environmental cues. Thank you. Okay, so here's a cross-section of an avocado flower. It's made up, the avocado does not have petals. These are called tepals. Even though this picture says sepal and petal, they're now called tepals. And then you have two circling the female portion of the flower. You have two whorls of anthers. And the anthers, these things right here, that is what releases the pollen. And then you have nectaries. This produces the nectar that the honeybees are after when the honeybees or other insects visit the flower. And then in the middle of the flower is the female portion of the flower. And the female portion of the flower is composed of three main parts. The stigma, so the pollen lands on the stigma, and then it grows down this long stalk called the style, and then it penetrates and fertilizes the ovule. Okay? We'll talk about that a little bit more. So there's two terminologies that we're going to go through then. We have pollination, which is the transfer of the pollen from the anther, the male portion of the flower, to the stigma, which is the female portion of the flower. And we have fertilization. And the fertilization is that the pollen grains germinate on the stigma. They grow down that style, and then they penetrate the female gamete, or the ovule, and that fusion is called the zygote. So think of human reproduction. It's very similar to human reproduction, that you have two haploid entities, the female gamete and the male gamete, and they join together. So just representation then. Here you have the pollen. For the process of pollination and fertilization, you need the pollen to be deposited upon the stigma. You need the stigma to be receptive. So you don't just put pollen on the stigma and say, oh, it's going to grow. It has to have all the right conditions for it to grow. Because the stigmatic surface on an avocado is wet. It is exuding a lot of sugars and other compounds to help stimulate those pollen grains landing on the stigma to germinate. Once the pollen grains germinate, and that is on the right-hand picture, these are all pollen grains that have germinated. This is a picture from Anaki Hermanza, and they're starting to grow down the style. Then they have to grow down to the ovule. So then we have the fourth step. The pollen grains are growing down. Now remember, we have a cross-section of the flower there. So the pollen grains are growing down. This is a picture of the ovule. One pollen grain is a race. So one pollen grain finally causes fertilization, and the seed then is that ovule, and the flesh of the fruit and the skin is the rest of it when you harvest the fruit. So that little thing that you see in the middle of the flower will grow and become the fruit. So avocados, as most of you know, they're not simple. So I showed you the diagram of the female phase of the flower, but we also know that avocados, the flowers will close and then they open later, and then they're male. And during the time that the flowers are closed, the stamens, when the flowers are open as female, the stamens are laying flat against the tepals. But when the flowers close, the stalk of the anther continues to grow. The filament is called the filament, and the pollen grains mature. And so when the flower opens the second time, it is male, and the pollen is released. And so the bottom picture is the male phase flower. And this is actually, if you look at this picture, and you can see this little circle here, right here, like this. That is these flaps that are opening up. And when those flaps open up, that's when the pollen is released. So if you go out in the field and you look at your trees and say they're in male phase, you really have to see if those little flap doors are open and the pollen is actually being released. So this is a diagram from Gadi Sham, who had spent most of his career working on avocado flowering. And so he actually further defined different stages of female and male. So what you have here is you have when the female flower first opened is more like a cup. And you see that the male portion of the flower is laying flat against the tepal. Then the flower is open as a female for a while. And then at some point it closes and the flower is cup shaped. And you can see here is a closed female flower. Now look at the shape. Okay. Then when the flower is reopened as male, you have the stamens, instead of laying flat against the tepal, they're standing up. And you have two rounds of pollen dehiscence. One is each of these stamens have two flap doors on it. And so the bottom one is the one that typically opens first. And note that the stamen right next to the ovule, the flap opens outward to the outside. And the flap on the interior whorl opens to the inside. And then the same goes for the second opening. Then after a while, the flowers will close. And you can see then the shape of the closed flower is quite different than the closed from after the female phase. So you could actually go out and look at your trees and be able to sort of tell where they are, where an individual flower is in the flowering process. So we have that. So that whole thing is called synchronous dichogamy. So now the other thing about avocados is that we have A and B flower types. And so this is just a partial list of different A and B flower types. So gem, Hass, lamb Hass are all A flower types. And B flower types are things like bacon, Edinger, Fuerte, Luna, Surprise, Gitano, etc. And what is the difference between that? I know this has been covered many times in talks, but in an A flower type, according to the paradigm, today was not the paradigm because it's cool, that female A flower type, so you would go out in the field in the morning and on a Hass, you would expect to see female flowers. Around noon, typically, these flowers will begin to close, and that individual flower will be closed all afternoon, all nighttime, all morning, and sometime in the early afternoon, that same flower will open again male. Now, a B flower type like Gitano or bacon, it opens up in the afternoon as female. It closes in the late afternoon, and then the following morning, it opens up as male. So if you have both varieties in the grove, the theory is that the the B flower types in the morning that are male will provide pollen to the A flower types. And conversely, we don't ever really think about this, but the A flower type will provide pollen to the female phase of the B flower type. So this is another diagram from Gadi Sham, and it shows then how the flowering really goes on the different varieties. So for an A flower type, they're female in the morning. This yellow is that first opening of the male flower before the pollen is dehisced or left out of the stamens. And then this is the male phase. In the type B, you can see that early in the morning, the flower is open, but the pollen has not been dehisced, and then they're male. And then in the afternoon, they become female. A different flower will open as female. So when we talk about pollination then is the transfer of the pollen from the anther to the stigma. And there's three different kinds of pollination. We have cross-pollination, which is the pollen is deposited on the stigma. It's from a different variety. So this is It's a ton of pollen going to the Hass variety. That's cross-pollination. We have a thing called close pollination, and this is when the pollen that is deposited on the stigma comes from the same variety, but is from a different flower. So if you have a Hass tree and you go out and you go, look, I got both male and female flowers open on my Hass tree, it's conceivable that you can have close pollination. And then true self-pollination is when the pollen is deposited on the stigma from the same flower. Now, if I went and did a genetic analysis of the seed in your Hass fruit, and I said it's a self fruit, I would not be able to tell you whether it's a close or self-pollination result, because it's the same outcome. But we can get overlap on trees. These are Hass flowers. So the top picture is the female phase. You can see that clearly because the stamens are oppressed next to the sepals. Here is the nectaries or the staminoids. You can see it glistening with nectar. And here's the stigma and the ovule. This flower is in male phase. It's just at the beginning of dehiscence because if you look carefully, you can see the flaps are opening here. But it's not in full dehiscence. Okay, but that's male phase. The other characteristic in male phase is often the petals or the tepals are reflex back from the flower. So if we look again at the pollination routes here, thinking about those concepts, we have cross-pollination where the pollen moves between different varieties. We have close pollination. So this is a pollen grain moving from one avocado Hass flower, for instance, to another, the stigma of another Hass avocado flower. And we have self-pollination, where theoretically the stigma is still receptive. The stigma is going to have to still be receptive 24 hours later on a Hass in order to receive the pollen from that same flower, within the same flower. So this is just to remind you, to get true self-pollination, you're going to have to move this pollen coming from here over to the stigma. And generally, it's not believed that self-pollination occurs to a great extent in avocados. You'll read papers saying, oh, we did all this genetic analysis and they're selves. Well, it could be coming from a close pollination event when the flowers are overlapping on the tree. And you're not going to be able to tell that by genetic analysis. So do we need a vector to get the pollen from the stigma? And common belief is, yes, you do need a vector. And two trials that were done, one was funded by the California Avocado Commission at Farm ACW in Fallbrook. It was led by Marllon, myself, Rodrigo Iturrita, and Ruben Hofschi. And then a larger scale trial repeating that, but in a more replicated form, was done in Chile in 2011. And that included additionally Jorge Schmidt, Francisco Mena, Francisco Gardiazabal, and Christian Magdal from the Catholic University of Valparaiso. And the end result on both of those trials was that these trials demonstrated that you need some kind of vector for the dissemination of the pollen, since there is essentially no fruit set when there is not a vector, including wind. Wind could be considered a vector, or an insect. So how many pollen grains? I mentioned to you this is a lot like human reproduction. So how many pollen grains in the stigma do you need to increase your odds of fruit set? And there's been quite a bit of research done on that, both by Inaki Hermanza and David Padmore in New Zealand in recent years. So how many do you need? So they've shown that even with a lot of honeybees, the percentage of flowers with any pollen deposited on the stigma is very, very, very low. Very low. And that was reported by all three, Cheval, Hermanza, and Padmore. The recent research by, so Cheval said you needed more than 20 pollen grains per stigma to get fruit set. More recently, Inaki indicated that you need greater than 50 pollen grains. And recently at a meeting I attended, David Padmore said you need over 100 pollen grains. You need a lot of pollen grains. That means you need a lot of vectoring of the pollen in order to get those pollen grains on that stigma at the right point in time. So pollinators of avocados or honeybees. They also use bumblebees in Israel. Flies have been documented to be good pollinators in Peru of avocados. And more recently, it's been hypothesized that hoverflies can do a good job here in Ventura County. But the thing is, and this is the point of the meeting today and the next speaker, is whether we can add pollen by other means so that we're not relying on insects. So with that, I'd like to introduce the next speaker, who is a postdoc in my lab.
Just wait a minute, Mary Lou.
Yeah.
Are there questions from the audience here or from the Zoom audience? And from the Zoom audience, if you have a question, type it into the chat.
Okay, with regards to the pollination cycle, is that one and done, or does a flower do it repeated days?
It only opens once it's female and once it's male. And when it's done, it's done.
So we know during wet and cold springs, honeybees don't like to work. What about bumblebees or hoverflies? Would it be a better option under those conditions?
Okay, so I don't know anything about hoverflies, so we'll have to leave that for the second speaker. Hamutahl might be able to answer that question, but bumblebees, they showed in a very large research project in Israel, probably 15, 20 years ago. It's in the California Avocado Society yearbook summarized, if you want to look at it under Gadi Sham. But they showed that bumblebees they can't replace honeybees, but they augment so that they're instead of being additive, they're synergistic. So you actually get greater thing. Then if you go to Avocado Cafe, Raffi Stern gave a talk about bumblebees in an Avocado Cafe, is it 2 years ago now? I don't know, about 2 years ago. If you go and look at Raffi's, we had a whole Avocado Cafe session about that, and we had Arnon Dog and Raffi Stern talked about what they're doing in Israel. There's a lot of activity in Israel on pollination of different tree crops.
Yeah.
But yes, so is that an answer you needed?
I can contribute just a little bit, which is, yeah, bumblebees can fly in cooler temperatures than honeybees. They have specialized wing muscles that they vibrate to warm up so they can get started in cooler weather. But we don't necessarily have an answer on in Ventura County, are they flying out when honeybees aren't? But I'm going to talk about a research project where we'll be like assessing some of those questions related to weather in my next talk.
Yeah,
So, are there questions from the Zoom audience?
you have to remember all this. I gave you the idealized version of avocado flowering, but on a day like today, or when we have very cold weather in the morning, the flower is confused. I mean, that's the easy way of saying the flower becomes very confused. And like today, when we went out, we saw CAS flowers male in the morning. There should have been female. So weather and other environmental conditions, Marllon will touch upon that, influences this paradigm that was established by Stout and Nairobi over 100 years ago.
A question, how many flowering sessions would be considered normal in the flowering season?
How many what?
Flowering sessions?
Flowering sessions? Not sure what that means. But, well, okay, so the trees flower for a long period of time. Depends on the environment. If you're in a hotter climate, the bloom is usually more compressed. Along the coast, it can be very elongated. The trees will continue to produce flowers if it doesn't set fruit. So that will prolong the flowering, but you know, a good avocado bloom could last at least 6 weeks, probably, if that's what they mean.
Do ants contribute to pollination?
Probably in a negative manner. We, when we did the project at ACW in Chile, we had ants and they did in the treatment, and they did not contribute to, at least ants in California and ants in Chile didn't seem to do the job.
Is presentation, oh, that's another question. There's in the chat. Can you read them?
I'll get it.
Can you speak more about wind, how it promotes pollination?
You're asking someone who doesn't believe in wind pollination? So the theory is because there was a researcher in Florida, Tom Davenport, to be specific, who believed in wind pollination for avocados. I'm not going to say that wind pollination will never occur, but I think it does not contribute substantially to your yield. When we did these net trials, we kept track of the wind. The net that we used was big enough so that you actually had wind in those net houses. And when we didn't have the bees, we had no fruit. Tom did a project that was funded by BARD and also the commission. One of the research sites was a pollinizer trial that I had in Ventura County here at the Derbyshire Ranch. And he occasionally would get fruit in the trees he netted, but they were like 90% less yield than what we saw in the trees out in the. So I don't believe the pollen is heavy. So it's going to fall. The stigma is not the kind of stigma that you normally associate the flower. The structure of the flower is not what you normally would associate with a wind pollinated plant. But I'm not going to say it never happens. I just don't think it's a main contributor.
Next one is, please talk about temperatures needed for fertilizations, both high and lows.
Okay, well, we're looking into that right now, but generally the ovule will be viable. So when the flower opens as female, the ovule is ready to go. It's ready for that pollen tube to grow down and fertilize it. And the ovule is generally good plus or minus 24 hours, depending upon temperature. So the temperatures are roughly above 85 degrees. So we have a really hot, dry day. The ovule is going to lose its viability sooner. If you have a very cold day, the ovule may stay viable longer, but it's also going to take the pollen tube longer to grow down to the ovule. And work that Margaret Sudgley did many years ago on Forte and Haas, that she did in growth chambers, but she kept Haas and Forte at different temperatures. She reported that, yes, you can get the pollen tubes growing, but most of the time the pollen tubes don't make it down to the ovule at low temperature. And that would be around 55 degrees. So the optimum window is probably somewhere around 68 to 80 degrees is probably optimum. But we're working on that. That's one of the things that Marllon is working on.
Another one, does each flower only open once?
Yes. Well, they open twice, but they open up first as female, they close, and then they open up as male. So they're open up twice, but they never reopen again.
Oh. Do trees in decline produce more flowers and fruit set than healthy trees in some sort of last gasp?
Well, yeah, you do see that, yes.
Yes. Okay. What can the home grower do with 2 avocado trees with too many ants?
With too many ants?
Ants.
Talk to Hamutahl.
Well,
Entomologist.
we can table that when she comes up here, but have you heard of spraying a mild solution of warm water and honey to attract pollinators?
Well, Gary Bender did that. I think you're going to attract ants as well. So we don't understand. Gary Bender felt that spraying the trees with water and a sugar solution he reported increased fruit set, but why, we don't know. So I don't want to take up too much time.
Yeah, let's take up more time. Any other questions? Adam?
Yes, Adam.
2 questions. First, any idea how long pollen is viable?
How long the pollen is viable?
Pollen grain?
The pollen grain, it's probably like 12 hours, right? Around 12 hours.
And from an evolutionary perspective, it seems like having female flowers open in the morning and males open in the afternoon is somewhat counterproductive. Is there any, why does it work in
Why
the
would it
system?
be counterproductive?
Well, you need the males are producing the pollen. You want that to get onto the female.
Well, that's why you have the A and B flower types. Because you have the B flower type that is male in the morning.
So do generally all orchards have both types?
Some people don't, some people do. It depends. I'll tell you an anecdote, because I'm old enough, I can tell anecdotes. When I first got hired, I knew nothing about avocados except that I like to eat them. And we had a Hass and a bacon tree in our backyard when I grew up. That was all I knew about avocados. And one of the very first things I did, there's maybe a couple people in this room that remember Don Gustafson. He was the farm advisor in San Diego County. And one of the very first things I do, I get in my car and I drive down to San Diego and I visit Don Gustafson. And I had read that the avocados have this, and Margaret Sedgley had just visited UC Riverside, so I was reading her papers. And I asked him about this. He goes, well, you know, when we used to have an avocado industry in Carlsbad and Leucadia and Oceanside, we never used pollinizers. We rarely use pollinizers. But he was a big believer that when you went inland where it's drier and hotter, that you benefit from pollinizers. So I go, that's interesting. I went to visit, then the next day I went to visit Don Rosedale, who was the farm advisor in Riverside County. He basically told me the same thing because he had been a farm advisor in LA County for a while. Then the following day, I drove up to Santa Barbara County and I visited George Goodall. He said, no way, we don't have pollinizers here in Santa Barbara County. We don't need it. But when you think about it, they have more mild. I didn't put a slide in here. There's a slide from an Israeli paper in the Avocado Society yearbook that shows temperature and overlap. And and then when I went to visit Bud Lee, I'll just finish the story first. Bud Lee said, George is full of it. You do need pollinizers. So it's a controversial topic, number one. Number two is that, and I've seen this, when you're up in the San Joaquin Valley or you're in Riverside, there is virtually no overlap on an individual tree. You got the females open, they close, and then sometime later, the male flowers open. So there's no overlap. If you go to a cooler climate, more humid climate like here, you get more overlap. And there's a dynamic, temperature is playing a very, very important role. And that's one of the things that Marllon is doing this postdoc on, is really trying to predict how much overlap you can get, that how the stigma stays receptive during that overlap period. And it's, you know, it's not very well known. It's not very well understood.
One more question.
Sure.
Does a tree pollinated with A, does a fruit taste different from that if it's pollinated with a B?
That would
You
be,
know that?
you know, do we have metaxenia? Mike Clegg did a project a long time ago where we looked for metaxenia on avocado, and they reported you get some change in seed size and seed shape. But flavor, you know what? I do a lot of taste panels. That would be almost impossible to prove I would predict, because every avocado tastes a little bit different. It's just, that would be an impossible. If you gave me $1 million, I would work on that project for you.
Can you go back to the picture, the Isham figure of the male and female flowers in their different stages? I had a question about that. It was earlier on.
Almost there.
There, I was wondering, do you have any tips for telling apart the end of the female phase B3 with maybe like D4? Because they look really similar. Or
No,
like-
because look, the stamens are longer, taller in D4 than they are in B3.
Okay.
The flower is more pointed,
Okay.
whereas B3, we actually were looking at this today in the field, because I'm not going to say that I'm an expert, but he has become an expert. So you need, when he's going to be living up here now for the next couple months, he can teach you. But you can clearly see the difference between C and E when you start looking.
Yes. Now, the tip about the stigma being taller than the stamens is
Yeah,
actually a
and you
great one.
should be able to see that the flaps are open. In D4, the pollen should have been released.
Mm.
Whereas in B3, the flaps will not be open.
Okay. The other question I had, and this is kind of like an obscure biological phenomenon, but when there's multiple pollen grains on the stigma and they all create pollen tubes, and then one hits an ovule and starts the fertilization process, what happens to the other one? Is there some sort of biological process where the other ovules are like no longer receptive, or do they just stop their growth?
Now you're asking me to remember 45 years ago.
I know. I feel like I should have remembered that from
But maybe
biology.
Marllon knows the answer to, you know the answer to that one? Too bad Anaki's not here. So she's asking, okay, but it's like human reproduction. You have all those sperm flying to the egg. So
Cell becomes impenetrable to the other sperm after the first one.
yeah, I don't know what, I can't tell you off the top of my head what happens, but we'll get the answer for you.
Do you have higher or lower rates of pollination during heavy wet seasons?
Heavy wet seasons?
Rain-
I can
rainy
tell,
seasons?
yeah, I don't have any data that I can show you that, but, there is I didn't show the slide because I was trying to keep my time tight, but we followed a flowering in Irvine for multiple varieties for 4 years. And what you see is that the length of the duration of the bloom varies from year to year within a variety. If you have a heavy crop, you're carrying a heavy crop on the tree, there's two things that are going to happen. Number one, you're going to have less flowers. But the other thing is you're going to delay flowering. So the flowering is going to be more compressed when you're carrying a heavy crop on the tree. When you have a light crop on the tree, they tend to flower a little bit earlier and the flowering can be more prolonged. So it does vary, on a wet year or a light year. A lot of times on a wet year, we might lose things to Polytotricum or anthracnose, because that will attack the young flowers as well. It's not a big problem here in California, but it's a big problem in very wet production areas.
So we'll have a next speaker, but hold your questions for after all the speakers. It's important to remember that for you ecologists here, this tree comes from a cloud forest where it's wet and cold and volcanic soils and it's raining all the time, and it's not growing naturally in Riverside.
Or Ventura.
Or Ventura, right, or California.
Yeah, so it's a great pleasure for me to introduce the next speaker. It's Marllon Santos. He's an agriculture engineer. He just recently got his PhD from the University of Sao Paulo. And part of his PhD, he was very lucky. I didn't delete his email when he wrote to me that whether I would have him come and spend a year, because they normally delete those emails. But anyway, I happened to open that email and it said, I have funding. So I said, it's not going to cost me any money. Come on in. And it was really a blessing that he came to our lab. He's a great, great individual. He specializes in plant physiology as part of his PhD, but he's a data rat, and he holds an MBA in data science and analytics on top of the PhD in plant physiology. His research focuses on fruit crops, particularly avocados, integrating data science and climate change studies. And in addition to his work in Brazil, he has international research experience in Chile and Italy and Spain as well, right? And he's currently a postdoc researcher in my lab at UC Riverside. And he's going to tell you about a project that we just received from the California Avocado Commission, what we're going to try to be doing on that. And even last year when he first came to the lab as a PhD student, we started trying to understand a little bit more about avocado flowering. And I feel very lucky that we're doing this project in conjunction with Inaki Hermanza, who is probably the world expert on avocado flowering. Marllon.
I would like to bring here today about the history, the artificial pollination, some classical examples, and some modern application that we have today. Thank you, Marllon, for presenting me for all. This here only to present fastly way to show this present for you. Mary Lou told about this. In the flowers, we have these two behaviors, these two principal behaviors about the pollination process. In the artificial pollination process, we have like some mechanical tools or manually stuff to make this process happen. Normally, the nature, this process happen by animals, by wind, or by water. We can use these three principal ways to transfer pollen from the anther to stigma of this flower. Here, I only will present some importance to artificial pollination process and challenge that we have for the future. Mary Lou told about the fruit set. The fruit set is the big challenge for the plants for avocado because we know that plant produce a lot of flowers, but we need the principal results that we need it's fruits in the plant. And we know in this short period that flowering season can happen a lot of different things like excess of water, excess of light, and we have like this bunch of problems. And maybe this can have an insufficient pollination between the trees. Another point that I will bring here is the decline of natural pollination and the condition of the weather in this short period. This can be this short period that's flowering can happen many problems, as I told you, the weather, the condition of the raining, and how can we supplement pollen for this kind of tree, for the artificial way. We need to understand exactly how addressing the specific pollination requirement for avocado. For example, we saw here this different behavior. We need to understand the flower behavior first to deliver pollen for the avocado trees. And this pollination dynamics is so huge. We need to understand the weather, the pollen viability. We need to understand the flower. We need to understand every part of this process of pollination process to have a good harvest or good quality of the fruits. Here, I only for curious, and we will bring some early practice because the artificial pollination is not a new technique that we're gonna present here. The Egyptian people who climbed the trees to pollinate it by hand, by dates. We saw example here for the fig tree. This kind of fig, this Ficus carica, they have like this specific way to pollinate the fruit because the tree is male and female trees is separate by the flowers, and normally the people from the Mediterranean, they use like the wasps to pollinate the larvae of the wasp to pollinate this fruit. And some people in this time they sell some fruits infested by these larvae to different approaches in the field to pollinate it. And we have this classical example for the corn. This ancestral of corn and this corn that we have today. And this is only use artificial pollination and select the new generation for this proposal. And these examples show how people can improve the crops controlling by pollination. We can make like a new generation of corns, for example. We can increase our productivity per area or per plant in only controlling this process of the pollination. Here, only for the curious, I bring some example that people use in artificial pollination in California. This picture I saw is super interesting. In the Coachella Valley, they start to plant date palms and they have like a less productivity, and they increase this productivity making manual artificial pollination in these trees in Coachella Valley. Another classical example that we have is for the figs. for the ficus, this is the one picture that I bring from internet. This Henry, this guy was responsible for the large farm in the world for the ficus, and they have this problem with pollination. And he started to buy fruits infested from Mediterranean areas to bring to California to help to pollinate the trees in California to increase the yield. And now I will show some example for artificial pollination that's working in different crops here. I will bring this classical example about the pistachio. Normally, the artificial pollination start in science in 1950. They use a different technologies for the pistachio. We know there's some helicopters, manual application, dry or wet application for the pollen. We have this kind of mechanism for vibration, for example, for pistachio, they shaking the tree or they shaking the flower to have a self-pollination in the tree or to harvest pollen and apply in a different trees. For the pistachio, for the kiwi, we have the same. We have like a robust, advanced technologies for this to apply and deliver pollen for the trees. An interesting example that I will bring here about the artificial pollination is about this protocol that we have for a cryopreservation. Cryopreservation is one protocol. How can I storage pollen for a long period and maintain the viability and the germination for this pollen grain? For example, for the dragon fruit, we have this kind of technology, but for avocado, we don't have. Like a protocol, how can I storage for the cryopreservation and use the future to save this pollen? And for dragon fruit, we have this in this manual. I will bring some example for cherry moya too. We have like a bunch of example that is possible to bring here. The people are using the artificial pollination to increase the yield or the productive per tree or per plant. And for avocado, what we have for avocado? If you try to put artificial pollination in avocado, you didn't find any paper about this. We have like a random studies with the flowers, with the stigma, with the flower behavior. We have all this many studies with this, not only one study directly using artificial pollination in avocado. And we saw here Science 2020 here, the increase of the number of the patents in the world. We saw all these patents is related for artificial pollination, and we saw that increase, but avocado is not, we don't have like a patent for avocado. And we need to mix all these studies and make one solution for avocado. That we are trying now to improve the avocado with artificial pollination. And we saw here the most of patents is from China. The US is a little bit here. The most of part of the world is green part here. What technology we have, we can apply it or use in avocado for delivery pollen or to harvest pollen or to make this artificial pollination process in avocado. This is one example that people use in charge, because we know that pollen has a charge and the flower has a charge, and these charges can match in the field. And to harvest pollen, we can use charge to harvest pollen, and we can use charge to deliver pollen for the tree. Here is one example for apple. Here we can use like a brushes for the manual. Yeah, you can put pollen in the middle, in this part here, and you can apply and control like a control crossing. You can make using this kind of stuff. For the dragon fruit, the people use to harvest pollen, the vacuum. You can harvest pollen because we know that dragon fruit only open the flower at night. We have like an example, like a vibration deficit. This is one example for the company from Israel, Blue Necks. They mimic the same shake that the body of the bee to pollinate these blueberries here in the field. You pass this machine and they have this vibration to shake the flower and deliver the pollen to the stigma. And we have like drones. we have this technology for drone, but we need to know how can I collect and how can I harvest the pollen grain to put in some drone, and what time is the best to apply for avocado. And here I bring some example, how can I storage this pollen? With a cryopreservation is a technology super expensive, but we need to develop this technology for avocado. And some desiccation techniques is the most usual for today. But we have like a wet way, like a dry way to deliver this pollen or storage this pollen too. And I only bring this picture here to present which technology is best for avocado and what is the best way to storage the pollen. We need to understand all this machine. We need to understand how can I storage the pollen. We need to understand which variety is better to provide pollen or to harvest pollen in a big quantity. And as Marllon told, we know this complex behavior of the flower avocado. We need to understand this better to deliver pollen. We need to understand the flower behavior before to deliver pollen. We need to understand these environmental factors about the weather, how can weather is gonna change in the future, in the dependence of these pollinators. We know that we dependence of the bee, we have like this dependence of the weather, we have all this dependence of the pollinator, and we know that bees is the price of the hive can be increasing year by year. And I will bring two examples here that we are working in UCR about the how can we understand this flower behavior. And I will bring here this first one project that we are working with in collaboration with Marllon. These 4 principal hypotheses that we have for the flower. The climate change will be impact of the behavior of the flower. We saw this in some papers that was proved this. We saw this this morning. We saw this in the field. The behavior of the flower is gonna be changed according to the weather. And the time that bee spend in the flower of avocado, if, for example, the flowers open at 5, the bee is gonna be in the flowers only 1 hour. After this, like 6, the bees go back to our house, to our hive, and we only will count with the wind to pollinate this tree normally, or moths at night normally. And this behavior, if the bees come to the flower only for 1 hour, maybe the productivity in the world, in the America, can be a decrease. Yeah, if we have like this strange behavior in the flower. And how can we try to prove all these hypotheses that we are seeing here using AI models to understand what's happened now and what's going to happen in the future with the behavior of this flower. In according to this behavior, we can predict which cultivar is going to be the best, which behavior has a more cross-pollination between trees. And here, what we know about this, they have like a bunch of papers showing the weather can change the behavior of the flower. If I have like a cool nights, the first open of the flower, the female phase is gonna be open more later, not early. If I have like a different condition in the weather, who's gonna will be responsible for this behavior, the temperature, the humidity, which parameter. And here we saw all the behavior of the flower, the first opening, the phase that is gonna be more able to receive the pollen grain, and here the flaps open. The question that you made it is the flaps here, you can see directly in the flaps of the anther of the flower. And we start this study here. When I sent you the email to Marllon, we start the study in the Lindcove, collecting data from the behavior of the flower in Lindcove, Irvine, and Riverside. We collect data in Peru, this big area they have like with avocado, and we collect data from Brazil too. All this data, we collect, we tag the flowers, many flowers. We make this pre-test here in California. We tag the flower. We saw that this is working. This behavior is different than common or than literature. And we bought a cameras to recording this behavior of the flower. We put these cameras this photo is from Peru. We saw the sand here. After we put these cameras in the field, we recording the flower 15 minutes. We make this time lapse to understand what's going to happen with the flower. And we make the annotation for the 63 parameters. Just to explain for you, for all here, this yellow parameters means the previous conditions in the previous day for the first opening of the flower. These green parameters here means the parameters during the flower opening, the female phase, and this last parameters in blue here is the parameters related to the male phase in the second open. With all this here, we create this kind of video. As you can see here, we're recording. I would like to in this arrow, this red arrow, see when it starts 5 here. This is one behavior that we saw in Peru. When it starts 5, the flowers female, it's open here. We saw the flower female open. They will be closed in the middle of the night. And they start to close in the middle of the night. And this flower is gonna be open again. And we didn't see any pollinators here. And probably this tree is gonna have a less productivity compared to the other trees. Yeah, and we saw like the flaps open here, the second open here for this variety. And using all this information, the information by video, the information by weather, for the day before, during the day, for the day after, we are creating some algorithm to predict what's going to happen in the future with the cultivars, with the flower behavior. For example, here is only the first insights that we have for this. For the female effective is this phase here, the second phase of the picture here. Which parameter will be affected this female phase? We saw in this, we test a different algorithms here to have a best prediction. And here we saw the average humidity during the day, in the previous day, or the temperature minimum in the previous days affect, this is the importance of this variety, this future, to predict this parameter here. We saw in the papers from Petmore that if I have like a cold night, the first open is gonna be more later. And probably this is, all these parameters here, we try to find a literature to understand better, how can I predict this? And here in this, what the principal goal of this research, we need to understand all the parameters for the weather is related, which parameter is related with this, all behaviors here, and we can predict what time this flower is gonna stay in this parameter if I have this condition on here, or if I have this condition in the future, if I have like a 2 degrees Celsius more in the temperature, what's gonna happen with this variety? I can choose this variety, or I can choose for what variety is going to be the best fruit cross-pollination. I can predict all this information to create like a map. For example, if we create a map in Ventura County to understand in this area, you can plant this variety and this variety, this cultivar, you gonna have the best cross-pollination between this variety. Or if I have like a bad condition is coming in this season, in this short period, I can supplement by pollen, or I can do another action for avoid some problems in this short period. And for now, for one solution, this is another project from CAC. For one solution for now, that we work in this algorithm to understand what's going to happen now and what's going to happen in the future. And for now, we're going to test different technologies for artificial pollination here in 5 orchards in Ventura to understand if these artificial pollinations work or which method is the best, the dry method or the wet method compared with a control. Here, I will only present some goals of these researchers. This biopollen is one company from Chile. They have like a wet pollen in the liquid and he can apply for the plants. This company has one algorithm that predict what time is the best way to apply pollen in avocado. This dusting method is that we bottle a pollen grain and apply in the plant. We compare with this control. This BBCH methodology is for the phenological stage, developed by Iñaki, adapted by Iñaki, and we saw the stages of the plants we're gonna see. The first thing that we're gonna do after apply the treatment and before these treatments, we're gonna see the viabilities of these pollen grains and the germination of this pollen. If this pollen that we are delivering for the tree has a good germination or good viability too. And we're gonna see the fruit set. This is the most important. We need to align all the parameters and see if this biopollen or dusting method can increase my fruit set or my yield per area or my number of fruits per plant. Let's see if this is gonna work. And for the second year of this project, in this year is gonna be the first year. For the second year, we're gonna make this pattern test with partner with Iñaki. And this pattern test is gonna show for us if this pollen come from this plant or coming from this technology that we are applying, to understand if this technology working really or this fruit set that I have here in the plant is random or come from the technology that we are applying. This is the map for all the orchards that we're gonna test here. Each orchard that we have here, we have all the treatment inside of this orchard. Just to put some conclusion and future directions here, the significance of the artificial pollination, we saw this short period that can be worse, and we need to have some strategies to supplementar or to deliver pollen for if I have like these bad conditions in the field. I hope all this contribution for the farmer, we can maybe have like a solution in the future. We can create one solution, improving some method that we saw here, if it's working. And for future perspectives, we need to expand these studies with artificial pollination. How can I storage? Which equipment is the best to apply? And we need to explore more the AI effect and precision pollination strategies for the future to understand now, and we can see the future about this behavior of the flower. And I hope this engage with the farmers, stakeholders to use a different approach in the new climate barriers here. And I would like to say thank you for California Avocado Society, Commission, UCR, and Mary Lou, and Ben.
And Marllon, are there questions from the audience?
Yeah.
How many here are using artificial pollen, supplemental pollen, flying it on, hand pollinating? You know, it's amazing that these people 2,000 years ago figured it out with dates.
Easy. Yeah.
Are there any questions from the chat room?
We use bees regularly, but find their assistance minimal to in set. What contributes to the consistency of off-year versus on-year production cycle of the avocados? Okay. We use bees regularly, but find their assistance minimal in set. What contributes to the consistency of off-year versus on-year production cycle of the avocado?
Well, a lot of things contribute to on and off years. So, but the individual is saying they find the input of the honeybees minimal, but what would happen if they had no bees? I mean, how do they know that it's a minimal input? It could be the overall health of the orchard. It could be that you have extreme alternate bearing. So there's many, many factors involved in flowering, fruit set, and carrying that fruit until you can actually harvest it. This is just literally like, it's just like this, fruit, pollination and fruit set are just the very first steps of that very long road that you're on when the trees flower to the time that you harvest.
I think question for you was not clear on the tools being studied to apply the pollen within the study. Are they expensive?
Yeah, for example, we will try to apply the pollen using backpack. This dry. Yeah, please.
So, as many of you know, biopollen is, it was also called Avo Solutions. It's been active here in Ventura County, and the company has agreed to partner with us. And so they spray the pollen on. They prefer to do it by drone, but because we can't have acres and acres in each test pot, then we're going to do it by backpack sprayer. The other method that was suggested to us by the Production Research Committee from the Commission was to use a dry pollen application. We met with a grower here in Santa Paula that is actually doing that. And we're purchasing pollen from the person that he purchases pollen, and he applies it with the backpack sprayer. And so we're going to do both of those. We attempted to work with the Blumex from Israel. They're not quite ready to deploy their technology here in California, but we're hoping next year that we'll be able to include them. And then we're going to have the control. Is it expensive? I don't know how much biopollen charges. I think the blowing the pollen on, the dry pollen, we're buying 10 grams of pollen. I think it's going to cost me $500. And then you have the backpack sprayer. So that's what that cost is.
Should we go ahead and try hand pollination now or wait for study results?
So hand pollination, I would never try. Even under the best of conditions, even the master of hand pollination, Alejandro Barrientos in Mexico, he reports less than 0.5% success rate. So to go out and do hand pollination of avocados, I think that, if you want to do that and walk around your grove, it's fine. But I think from a practical perspective, and Naki told me they did hand pollinations in Spain, and they got about the same results. So because hand pollination, now maybe if we know the algorithm that's controlling or predicting optimum flowering conditions, maybe you would have higher success rate. But I think it's a numbers game. You've got to have a lot of pollen on that stigma. I think the data clearly shows that. You have to have the right conditions for that pollen grain to germinate and go down to the ovule. And you have to have the right conditions for fertilization and that initial fruit set. So I wouldn't spend my time hand pollinating. Sorry, I took over.
Yeah, with regards to the pollination, what is the source of the pollen and what is its longevity in storage?
Well, that's a great question. So the pollen we're using for the dry pollen, the gentleman I'm buying the pollen from told me it comes from Azutano pollen from Paso Robles. He did not really reveal to me when I asked how the pollen is harvested or processed, but we're going to buy it and we're going to apply it according to how they're directing us to apply it. On the biopollen, I know they harvest the pollen and is put into liquid suspension. And I know in both cases, there's other things added to the mixture, but what they are, they're proprietary. And I don't think that we'll find out what they are. We can guess, but I don't know for sure. Oh yeah, and Blumex, the company out of Israel, is using an electrostatic charge. So the pollen grain has a different charge than the stigma. And that's what they're taking advantage of. Now, Blumex, although they're not here in California, I first met the woman who's in charge of their field research when I went to South Africa last year to the Maluma Alesbeste Symposium. And there they reported, Xander Ernst reported preliminary results of the trial they did with them. And he believed that it actually boosted the fruit set and yield in 2 of their blocks to a point where they have now expanded what they're doing with Blumex this season. And I think I'm planning on going to the Alesbeste Symposium again this year, so I guess I'll be able to come back and tell you what they found this year. But, you know, and they have better conditions for fruit set than we do here in California, but Xander believes that it boosted their production.
For pollination by helicopter, what is the best indicator to start the fertilization?
Well, Biopollen has an algorithm. We were told by the company they have an algorithm. For our study, they're going to go out and they have an algorithm where they're looking at temperature and other factors. And then we were told that they go out 3 to 5 times during the avocado flowering season. So if you have a 6-week flowering season, they'll probably go out like almost every other week.
6 months here.
Yeah, well, on the coast, you're right. 6 months. If you were doing it in the San Joaquin Valley, you probably have like 3.5 weeks because conditions are different there. The flowering's more compressed. So I can't really answer that question because I don't know.
You have mentioned product that could affect the timing of flowering. Could you repeat the name of and elaborate a little more about that?
A product?
Yeah, I mentioned a product that could affect the timing of flowering.
I didn't talk. Really, my talk. I don't remember that. I mean, there's a lot of things that factor into the timing, but they're environmental. I mean, but if you have a heavy crop on the tree, you're going to delay bloom. If you have a light crop, they'll probably flower earlier. Also, the duration of the bloom is influenced by the crop load that you're carrying on the tree. So maybe that's what they were thinking.
So how effective is the use of pheromone sprays to increase fruit?
Pheromone sprays. You did work on pheromone sprays, didn't you?
Yeah, they don't.
So Ben Faber, for the people on Zoom, Ben Faber is saying pheromone sprays did not work in his trial.
And the honey sprays don't work, or the sugar sprays don't work either.
Yeah, I mean, between you and Gary Bender, you've probably tried almost everything.
Hey, why don't we go on to the next speakers?
Thank
and
you.
Then we can have a whole panel discussion about this. It's going to go on for years, I'm sure. So our next speaker is Hamutahl Cohen, who's an entomologist in our office here at UC Cooperative Extension Ventura. And she is going to talk from the animal point of view. So go for it, Hamutahl.
Hi, I'm Hamutahl. So I am a cooperative extension advisor in entomology. I mostly work on pest management issues in all of our regional crops. So avocado, lemons, strawberries, brassicas, you name it. But this is my first project in this position working on pollination. So that's really exciting. I am going to give you a background on the different insects that are pollinating or might be pollinating avocado. And I'll talk a little bit about some research that we just started up, and that is the collaborative effort of everyone you see listed on this slide. So I just want you to keep in mind that it's not all just me, but Ben is involved. We have some researchers from UC Davis, Berkeley, and Adam, who's here from Santa Barbara as well. Okay, so I'm going to kind of skip this because Mary Lou did a great job giving an overview of pollination and what it is. But yeah, it's the movement of the pollen to the female stigma. Avocado flowers are complete flowers. They have male and female parts. They open as a female, then they open as a male. You guys heard all of this already. You guys heard about the different pollination types, self, close and cross-pollination. It's the cross-pollination that we think enhances fruit set. The question was pollination from a neighboring tree. So if that neighboring tree is the same cultivar, it would be considered close pollination, but different cultivar than cross-pollination. So the factors influencing cross-pollination, pollination between A and B cultivars. Here's kind of what we know, and then I'll talk about what we don't know. The distance between the pollinizer, the pollen donor, and your target tree can be important. So I'll talk a lot about bee behavior, but a lot of bees just forage within a few trees. And so having your pollen tree spread out, your pollinizer tree spread out across the orchard can help. The length of the overlap period. So Mary Lou, you covered a lot of this already, but in cooler weather, there can be a longer overlap period where there's male and female flowers open on the same cultivar. And then pollinator species, their behavior, their activity, their efficiency. That's where we have a lot of unknowns. And that's what I want to focus on for this talk primarily. Who are the pollinator species and how do they behave in avocado and broadly as well? Okay, so who are the avocado pollinators? What do we know about their behavior and what influences their diversity and behavior? I'm going to start with bees, and I have examples of bees that are not necessarily avocado pollinators just because I'm a little bit of a bee nerd and I love them so much. But after like a few general slides, I'll narrow down back to avocado. So bees are incredibly diverse. They come in all colors and shapes and sizes. There are 20,000 species of bees globally, and there's about 4,000 species in North America. So honeybees are introduced, non-native, managed bees. These other species are primarily considered wild bees or unmanaged bees. All bees are within the order Hymenoptera, which includes bees, wasps, and ants. But what separates them from wasps and ants is that they have these specialized hairs. So these are close-up pictures of bee hairs, and you can see that each one is branched, almost like a tree. And it's that branching that allows pollen to get stuck on the bee. So when they move from flower to flower, that pollen gets moved around accidentally as they're collecting pollen and nectar to consume. They eat pollen for protein and nectar for carbohydrates. And wasps, ants, they may have hairs, but they won't be branched like this. Bees come in all kinds of sizes. So these are not examples of bees that visit avocado, but I just think it's a compelling illustration. So on the left, we have a stingless bee. You can see the entire length of the bee is about the length of a honeybee leg for comparison. And then on the right, we have Wallace's giant bee. Its head is about the length of a honeybee. This bee is found only in Indonesia. It makes its nest inside the active termite nests of termites, and it uses those big mandibles to collect resin to line its nests. Bees behave differently in terms of their habitat requirements and their nesting behaviors. So some bees live in the ground and they either use pre-existing cavities or they dig their own nests. Other bees nest above ground, and same thing, sometimes they use pre-existing cavities and sometimes they make their own cavities themselves. You might think of like a carpenter bee makes its own cavity. So when you think about what they might need to flourish, they need things like dead twigs if they're a cavity nester. They need things like undisturbed, untilled, unmulched land if they're a ground nester. Bees also vary in social behaviors. So honeybees and bumblebees are social. They have overlapping generations in the same group, cooperative brood care, division of labor, but other bees are solitary. They might live by themselves or like loosely aggregate together. They vary in specialization. Honeybees are generalists. They'll basically visit anything, but a lot of other bees only like one or two or a few types of flowers and plants. They vary in how far they're going to fly. So honeybees, if they need to, can go 7 miles, 10 kilometers from the hive. But for a lot of these solitary wild bees, their flight distance is something more like half a kilometer. So when you think about attracting bees to your site, they're not going to be coming from super far away. So your site has to be a good environment for them. They vary in nesting materials and what they like to make their nests out of. So some of them will use leaves or mud, or they'll produce like a cellophane-like material to line their nests. And others use wax like honeybees. And then they differ in metabolism, disease resistance, and a whole host of other features as well. They also differ in how they collect pollen, and that's going to impact their ability to visit different flowers like avocado flowers. Some bees have a scopa, which is a dense hair-like brush, and it'll be found either on their back leg at the top or bottom or middle of the leg, or it'll be found on their abdomen, like this bee at the bottom. So they'll land on a flower and then pack pollen onto their abdomen. Other bees, instead of having a dense hairbrush, will have something called a corbicula, which is a hairless, kind of scooped out, flattened part on their leg. Honeybees and bumblebees have corbiculas, so they pack pollen into balls and rest it on their corbicula for transport. And then this bee seemingly doesn't have either a corbicula or a scopa. Does anyone know what's going on with this bee? How does it collect pollen and nectar? Any guesses? Okay, well, this bee actually doesn't collect pollen and nectar. It's kind of a trick question. It's a kleptoparasitic bee. It steals pollen and nectar from other bees. So some bees are thieves, just kind of like cuckoo birds, and they actually might go into the nests of other bees, and they might even eat their young sometimes. Ooh. Okay, bees in California, there's 1,600 species of wild bees, and I just wanted to highlight two that are like totally different just to show the diversity of bees that we have here. The yellow-faced bee is tiny. It's sleek like a little race car with yellow markings, and then we have this like teddy bear-like bee, the male valley carpenter bee. So now I'm going to talk about the bees that we know specifically visit avocado. The one we all know the most is the honeybee. And there's three kind of honeybee behaviors when they're foraging in an avocado field. So some honeybees visit both male and female flowers on a foraging trip, and they collect pollen and nectar. So they're really great at pollinating. Some visit both male and females for just nectar. They're not going to collect pollen. And then some visit only males on a foraging trip, and they only collect pollen to take back to the hive. So those last bees, those bees that only collect pollen, that only visit males, are not providing pollination because they're not visiting females. But these two other groups, the nectar and pollen collectors and the nectar collectors, provide pollination. So this is a picture of a bee. This one is collecting nectar on a male flower. And even though it's not necessarily collecting pollen, you can see there's pollen on its tongue, there's pollen in between the antenna and on the lower side of the head. And so it does provide pollination while it forages. Majority of honeybees will visit just a few trees. They're performing cross-pollination between two types of cultivars, only if they're located close to one another within a couple of rows. And then there's a few bees, they're called scouts, that have a longer foraging distance, and they're going to move pollen all the way down the orchard. And that's why when you increase honeybee density, when you up the number of hives in your orchard, you're going to get more of those bees that are scouts that are going to go farther. So that might be why you're seeing increased pollination with increasing beehive numbers. Honeybees, we all know this, have preferences. I'm sure you've seen them just like skip over your avocado orchard and just go into the hillside and go to wild flowers. And there's been studies that look at bee preferences, and they very consistently will pick other flowers that are not avocado. So when it comes to citrus flowers and avocado flowers, they've been shown to prefer citrus flowers. They like the odor of it a lot more than avocado flower odors. This phenomenon, this preference for non-crop flowers over avocado, has been observed for a long time. We've known this since like at least the 60s. We're not exactly sure why avocado flowers are so unattractive, but it's likely due to high levels of certain minerals, possibly potassium and phosphorus. Moving on from honeybees, bumblebees. So there are many bumblebee species, and there are a few wild species that are unmanaged that you might see in an avocado orchard in California. So Bombus bostonsenskia, yellow-faced bee, Bombus californicus, and Bombus melanogypus. And then there are managed bumblebees as well. So you can obtain managed bumblebees, but they're very difficult to source. I know corporate sells them, but I've heard they have, a really hard time rearing them. They're not always available. Generally, those hives, each colony that you might purchase will have 100 individuals or less, but they're likely very efficient pollinators. And there have been very few studies in California. Maybe you know more than I do. I could only find one that was published. And it showed that they do forage in HAS, and they seem to enhance yields at the trees that are near the colonies, near the managed colonies. Okay, wild bees. So a lot of the research that we're doing now on wild bees builds off work by Gordon Franke from the last few years. And he's observed 31 different bee species visiting avocado flowers. Adam, who's talking after me, is going to go through, I think, a lot of those species in more detail. But just kind of like a little preview, some of the most common ones in avocado are the small carpenter bee, Ceratina. Agapes montexanus is not a small carpenter bee. Sorry, that one is like a green sweat bee is the common name. And then Halictus tripartitis and Lasioglossum look really similar. They're kind of the brown sweat bees. So these are all solitary wild bees that are known to visit avocado. Okay, so how do we attract wild bees to avocado farms? We know that wild bees need diverse flora resources, and they need resources year-round because they live in place. And one of the biggest kind of methods to attract wild bees is hedgerows. There have been a lot of studies in different cropping systems showing that hedgerows, intentionally planted strips of flowers and, both annual and perennial, we know that they can enhance crop pollination and increase pollinator diversity. But all those other studies that are published have all been in crops with really, really attractive flowers. So those studies have been in things like sunflower, for example. So in a sunflower system, a hedgerow is going to attract wild bees preliminarily to a site, and then the sunflower blooms, and you get amazing pollination because sunflower is so appealing to a bee, to all kinds of bees, because it's a composite flower. In a flower like avocado, it's unclear if adding in floral resources is going to enhance avocado pollination or might actually detract for it. Like, is it actually just going to keep the bees in the hedgerow, and are they not going to go to the avocado flower? So this is kind of an unknown that we're hoping to answer. Moving on from bees, talk just a tiny bit about some of the other insects. Wasps, we know a lot less about wasps. They can be hairy, but again, that hair is not branched. They eat pollen and nectar. Some of them are carnivorous as well. There's about 7 species we've seen visiting avocado flowers in Santa Barbara and Ventura counties. Flies can be potentially really good pollinators because unlike bees, which move systematically down a row, they move kind of erratically through an orchard. And when bees move erratically, it's been shown to enhance pollination. So flies moving erratically might be a good thing. But unlike bees, they don't have those branched hairs. They're not systematically collecting pollen, but they could be good pollinators. They're generally attracted to white flowers as well. And we see a lot of them on avocado, at least 20 different species. The most abundant fly that we see visiting avocado flowers in Ventura County are the syrphid flies. There are hundreds of species of syrphid flies, and 9 of those species have been recorded on avocado here. Syrphid flies kind of look a little bit like bees. They're bee mimics, but they have these big red eyes that touch in the middle. They don't have those long antennae. They have like short little antennae called arista. They have 1 pair of wing instead of 2 pairs of wing. And they're great for other reasons that bees are not. They provide a lot of biological control of pests. So specifically their larvae, their juvenile form eat Asian citrusillid, they eat aphids and other soft-bodied pests. So I put a little picture of that at the bottom left. So in general, they're like a great thing to try to attract. And we know that they're highly attracted to sweet alyssum. It's very successful at bringing in syrphid flies to an orchard. Other flies as well observed on avocado. Blowflies, both blue and green, they're different species, are known for visiting avocado, but we don't know at all, are they good pollinators? We know very little about their contribution to pollination. And then there might be some other pollinators as well. So beetles, I've observed ladybugs visiting flowers. There's soldier beetles that we see on avocado. There's thrips. I think there was, a while back, some idea that maybe flower thrips are providing pollination, but I think that's been debunked a little bit. Oh yeah, so yeah, like they're not the primary pollinators. What he found, so that I didn't see anything besides like the first year of data from that in like a report. So yeah, they're not the primary pollinators, but maybe they're contributing something. I thought was the takeaway from that, right? You need bees. Okay, cool. So you need bees. Another thing is moths, right? So we know that avocado flowering does weird things with weather, and maybe moths might be contributing to pollination as well. So in that overview, I don't know about you, but I get a lot of questions that come up. So the questions are, who exactly are the visitors? Like what are the species, right? Not just like flies are visiting, which species of fly, which species of wasps, which species of bees, and how are they influenced by hedgerows and habitat enhancements? Adam's going to talk about that. The other question is, what are the efficiency of different species? I put up this graph from a paper from 2003 that looked at different visitors in, I think it was Ventura County, not Santa Barbara County, avocados. And it showed that 80% of visitors were syrphid flies. But are they actually efficient pollinators? We don't know. And then I have the same question that you guys have about weather and how that's impacting pollination dynamics, both the flowering and the pollinators. Okay, so to start getting at some of these questions, this past year, we started looking at avocado visitors, and we're working in 10 avocado sites in Ventura County, and there's some differences between them. So they vary in the amount of natural habitat that they have in the landscape. Some are close to restoration areas, some are close to urban areas, some are just like nestled in pure agricultural areas. And then they also vary locally in the amount of vegetation in the margins. So some of them have bare margins, they're managed to be empty. Others have intentionally planted hedgerows or vegetation. And so these questions, these differences in their composition locally and at the landscape scale allow us to ask those questions about habitat enhancements and how it's impacting the pollinators. We talked about hedgerows a little bit, just a touch more about them. Hedgerows are these strips of usually perennial plants, but you can also have flowering strips that are annual plants. They are thought to create habitat for insects, not just pollinators, but natural enemies as well, parasitoids and predators like lacewings and big-eyed bugs and all the really good ones. They can attract birds that eat pests, and they can reduce pesticide costs. But, they could be attracting pests. They could be keeping pollinators on the hedgerow. They might only be effective when they're near larger habitat patches or far away from other habitat patches. So lots of questions about hedgerows. To start looking at the impact of hedgerows and weather and habitat on pollinators and who they are, we went out and we did visual surveys for floral visitors. And then we collected the visitors with nets. And we did that in the morning and the afternoon because the flowers change throughout the day. And we did it on 1 meter squared quadrats on trees at every site that we had along a transect. And we went out 4 times. We looked at temperature and wind, and we also counted the flowers in the field when we went out as well. After bloom, we let some time pass, and then we returned to those same clusters where we had done observations, and we counted the number of fruits, and we measured their volume, like how wide and tall they are. We only have 1 year of data. It's very preliminary, so I'll share what we have. We're not done identifying our bees yet. So our first question was if we broadly categorize our sites by having hedgerows and not having hedgerows, is there any difference in the number of flower visitors? And the answer is no. We didn't see that. It's too broad scale of a question. I think once we break down our visitors by type and by species, we might see more patterns here, but we just can't do that yet since we're not done identifying them. Then we looked at some of our temperature data. Preliminarily, we're how does temperature impact the number of visitors? And this was kind of like a duh moment at sites that were warmer. There were more visitors, but going forward, we're going to be collecting more fine-scale temperature and humidity data using sensors in the canopy, and hopefully be able to start asking questions about how temperature impacts, the ratio of male to female flowers that are open and some of the behaviors of the actual pollinators. Okay, and then we had these 2 questions. Does the local flower community impact the pollinators and fruit set? And does the landscape level natural habitat kind of quality and abundance influence pollinators and fruit set? One of the questions we were able to look at that we did have the data for was looking at non-crop flowers from hedgerows and weeds and the impact on fruit count. And it was kind of cool to see that even with just 1 season of data, that as you have more flowers at a site, or rather clusters that have more non-crop flowers around them, had higher fruit count. And that was significant. So that's kind of a cool pattern. It didn't matter if the flowers were from weeds or from intentionally planted hedgerows. So kind of looking at this, you probably assume, well, probably what's happening is it's impacting the pollinators. If there's more flowers in your field or next to your field, there is going to attract more bees and flies and wasps, and that's why there's higher fruit count. We just can't look at that entirely yet because we don't have all that data, but we do have the honeybee data. And indeed, we did see that as the amount of non-crop flowers increases, there's a positive impact on honeybee visitation. But that differed based on the site type. So sites that were bare, that didn't have anything intentionally planted, when there was flowers increasing, that meant there was more honeybees visiting. But sites that had flowers that were intentionally planted with hedgerows, that effect was much less pronounced. Okay, so we have a lot more work to do. We're still identifying our pollinators. We're hoping to look at how non-crop flowers and natural habitat impact the visitor diversity and fruit set. Seems like local habitat is going to be important. It seems like hedgerows are going to have a positive effect on pollination, an enhancement effect, but that's, again, very preliminary. We're going to be replicating this study. We're going to be going out more frequently this next year. And one of our goals is to start looking at the individual species and what their contribution is to pollination. So we're actually going to be catching the species, individuals from each species, and counting avocado pollen on their bodies. And then we'll also be doing pollination studies next year where we'll be like bagging flowers and opening them and allowing visitors to come and then looking at fruit set. So there's a lot more in the works that I'm excited to share with you. And that's it for me. I'll do questions now.
Yeah, what do ants do?
Oh, what do the ants do?
Yeah.
I don't know. They're always on the flowers, but I assume they're just taking the nectar. I don't know if they're moving anything around.
Any questions from the audience?
Yeah, what about
Ladybugs?
I see them on the flowers all the time. I know they're taking nectar. I don't know if they're taking pollen also, but we'll catch some of them and we'll look for avocado pollen on them. And then there's the moths as well. So our study is in the daytime, but Adam and I have a master's student working with us who couldn't be here today. She's from Cal Poly Pomona. She's going to be coming out in the evenings and collecting moths and looking at pollen on their body. So that's going to be cool.
Questions from the audience or the Zoom audience?
Is the pollen collected by the bees who only visit male flowers get dispersed to other foragers present within the hive such that it can be delivered outside the hive when they head out?
No, it's a really good question, but what they do is they go back to the hive and they clean themselves off, or they help each other clean off, and then they take the pollen, they store it and feed it to their young. So they usually, when they go back out again, they're pretty clean. So I wouldn't expect them to then be able to move it later.
How much? Yeah, it says how much does pollen move around within the hive?
Within the hive?
Yeah.
So once it's in the hive, it's stored away. It's often fed directly to larvae that are developing, or it's capped off and saved for later, I think. So once it's in the hive, it doesn't move out of the hive. Unless there might be something about like that I don't know, but that's my understanding.
That's an interesting one here. Are there genetically engineered avocado cultivators?
To like open
That
at certain
was-
times or
that
be
was the
closed at certain
question.
times? I don't think so, right, Ben? There's no like GMO avocado. No is the answer.
No. What percentage of avocado sets are from non-honeybees?
So we don't know that. And that's what we're hoping to answer. Not this upcoming spring, but next spring when we do our pollination experiment. So we'll try to compare fruit set on flower clusters that were visited by honeybees versus not honeybees. But it's really those kind of experiments, they're difficult and tedious, and it's really hard to get definitive answers out of them. So we'll see. We'll see what we get.
Is it possible for you to tell how native pollinators are impacting fruit set versus non-native honeybees, or is that too difficult to tell?
So yeah, again, we might be able to get a little bit of that with what the pollination contribution from each one. We're less interested, I think, also in like the native versus not native question, but more like by species or managed versus unmanaged.
Remember, honeybees are not from this continent. Avocados come from here. All the really good studies on placement of hives and number of hives come from Israel, where avocados are not native and they don't have the native suite of potential pollinators. So, I mean, avocados grew up a long time before honeybees showed up.
Yeah, there's a lot of research in Israel. We definitely need more here in California to kind of fill in those gaps.
Is native mustard flower weed a high-value nectar pollen to increase hive health?
Mustard is very attractive to bees when there's nothing else, but it's considered a low quality pollen and nectar resource. Yeah, right, Adam? That's my understanding. Yeah, I don't think it's as high in protein or like as nutritious. From like one study I read, yeah. No, I wouldn't like plant mustard though. It's a invasive. Don't plant mustard for your bees. There's other choices. So if you're interested in what kind of flowers to plant. I don't know why I didn't include this on the slides. There's lots of resources at the UCANR website. NRCS also has a lot of resources available all online with recommendations, not just for plant species, but what combination of plant species provides year-round bloom in fall, winter, spring, and summer so that you're supporting pollinators year-round.
What research is being looked at to develop different crossbreeds for better pollinators?
Is there any research, Ben, on like crossbreeds of plants? Oh, of bees?
Of bees.
There's no research on that. So some cultivars of honeybees might have might prefer avocado flowers more than other cultivars of honeybees. I think I mentioned them on the slides, but I didn't actually talk about it. There was a study in Israel that found that the New World Carnelian bees are more likely to collect avocado pollen than the Italian-based bees. But when they replicated that study in California, there's no significant difference in the honeybee cultivars for avocado preference. So the answer is no one's doing that right now, and I don't think there are plans to for honeybees. The question was, how do weather conditions impact the pollinators? Yeah, the temperature conditions. We don't really have that data available yet, but we are going to be putting out temperature sensors in our orchards where we're collecting pollinator data. And we may find that under certain conditions, there's more of one type of pollinator versus another type. I don't have any data on that to share right now.
Are you considering in the study a comparison between artificial pollination and strategies to preserve the native and bees population in the orchards?
Okay. So we're not going to do anything with the native pollinators, but we are more than happy to work with Hamutahl on that one. If she wants to survey our sites. That's right. But the other question is that we are going to, all the groves that we're working in bring honeybees in. And that's how biopollen has been working so far, is that they're an augmentation to honeybees. So our control treatment will be just honeybees. The dry pollen application and the biopollen application will be an augmentation to the bees that are placed in the orchard. I think that answered that question.
Yeah. How much do cultivation practices, irrigation, fertilization, pest management contribute to increased flowering on flower receptivity versus environmental conditions? And which practice have been found to be most effective?
Great question that I can't answer. Sorry.
Yeah. So our next speaker is Adam Lambert. He's out of UC Santa Barbara. He's an ecologist that's been working on plants and animals and insects that are affecting the ecology here. So Adam, can you take it away? Or, oh, it's coming. There it is. You got it.
Oops, there we go. I'm going to give you a little bit of background, sort of on the river, this agricultural watershed, and then sort of leads into what Hamutahl was discussing with you. Hamutahl is a co-PI on this research as well. Beckett is a former undergrad who's now a research associate with me, who's done a lot of the identification of the bees, several thousand individuals, or probably more than 10,000 individuals. And Carson is our graduate student that Hamutahl mentioned that is actually leading up this research project. And this is part of a much larger research project with Cal Poly Pomona that I'll describe a little bit as I go through the slides. So Hamutahl and I are focused on insects. There's another lab group looking at small mammals, reptiles, amphibians. Another group looking at bird interactions between natural areas and riparian, and anything else? I think there's, and bats as well. There's another researcher looking at bats. So it's pretty comprehensive, looking at how natural areas can improve benefits to orchard agricultural, primarily orchards throughout the river valley. And you see at the top, those are the leading ladies of this. And I say leading ladies because many of you may know most of the bees you run across are female just because of their reproductive system. Except for the very first one, I noticed that that's a male agapostum in there. And you can tell the females are all green. The males have the black and yellow striped abdomen. So if you see those in your orchards, they're really neat, cute bees. So my primary focus in the river is ecological restoration, restoring old agricultural properties in the river channel itself, where it makes sense to benefit both water resources and agricultural productivity within the Santa Clara. So I'll discuss that a little bit. My background actually, as I sort of classically trained as a biocontrol entomologist. So earlier in my career, I studied methods of using insects to control pest insects, but also invasive weeds, both in natural areas and agriculture. But I've sort of transitioned to more landscape scale interests, including large scale restoration and how that can benefit wild populations of organisms and primarily insects that we're interested in. So to give you a little background on the Santa Clara River, it's the largest relatively natural river left in Southern California. If you think of many of the other rivers, they're either channelized or have pretty serious flood control or other structures on those rivers. It starts up in, the headwaters are up behind Los Angeles in the San Gabriel Mountains. It flows almost 100 miles and empties here, right between Ventura and Oxnard. And you can see some of the farms. This is up in Fillmore, this particular photo. Let me see if this pointer works. And you can see some orchards. I actually think this is King Ranch up here that's pointing to, but lots of lemons and avocados along the river. One of the most problematic weeds in the river is giant reed or arundo that many of you may know of. It occupies several thousand acres within the river, and it's a big issue both for wildlife, but also for the fire risk it poses. It's a very flammable plant, but also flood hazard too, because it has shallow roots and it's easily uprooted and causes pretty major flood problems during the large floods that we sometimes have in the river. And you can see the size of this grass. It is the largest grass in the world. That's me right there standing next to a patch. So it's a really large plant. And the other photo is of, this is the rhizomes, which are underground structures that it uses for reproduction. So during a major flood, they get ripped up and spread around the river. And once either the stems or mostly the rhizomes land in a new spot, they'll just resprout and grow again. It is non-native. This is a plant from Southeast Asia. So here's a monotypic stand of arundo in Fillmore, just to give you an example of the process we go through to remove this particular invasive plant. Oftentimes we have to use large mastication and then treatment afterwards, several years of treatment with herbicides to kill the root structures of these plants. That's really the only way to remove it from rivers. Here's a treated area. After several years of treatment, you can see oftentimes in these large patches, it's pretty barren. So we need to go back in after that and revegetate sites. And so we use a whole host of native riparian species. Good point to make here is that there are sort of two vegetation types within Southern California rivers or Southwest rivers. We have riparian forests, which are mostly large willow and cottonwood trees in the more moist areas. And in the drier areas, it's riparian scrub, and that'll be important a little later on. And so associated with the ecosystem benefits, we also monitor wildlife responses to restoration, and specifically large-scale restoration. And so that's sort of how I get involved in this particular project of looking not only how does restoration benefit wildlife along the river and other ecosystem services, but also within adjacent orchards. And so that's how I've become involved with a really good working relationship with Hamutahl, looking at pollinators associated with this as well. Okay, so a main research question for us is how does native vegetation and particularly restoration influence beneficial insect populations in these adjacent orchards along the Santa Clara River? And so a lot of what you often hear in discussion of this is sort of local processes at the orchard level, one or a few orchards, although many in this group are also working among lots of orchards along the river, but we want to take an even broader approach, looking at essentially the whole floodplain, and I'll show you a map of our study sites along the river. And so associated with that, what benefits does restoration and natural vegetation contribute in terms of pollination, but also natural enemies? And Hamutahl is specifically heading that up as well. And I'll talk a little bit about this today because it's of interest to this group. Is there a difference between lemon and avocados when we talk about natural vegetation as well? Okay, so this is a slide I just added to this from Hamutahl, so I'll try and do it justice. And this is just to show you how the percent of natural habitat here, as you can see here on the x-axis, as the percent of natural habitat increases, pollinator richness also increases. So as you restore more and more area, you also improve pollinator richness and abundance in these areas. And this also is important for what I'll be talking about in a minute as well. And this is, and where is this from? Is this your, these are from your sites? Okay, so this is an analysis you did. Okay, great. Right, okay, so richness is the number of unique pollinator species that we find, the number of unique bee species that we're finding along the river. So I'll talk about two different things. I'll talk about abundance, that just means the total number of bees we find. And then richness is the number of unique individual species of bees we find. And from an ecological perspective, that's important. Okay, so this map shows some of our research sites along the river, starting up here in Fillmore. We have a couple of sites, and then going down throughout the river valley. Our sites closest to the ocean are down here in Satakoy. And so we wanted to look at multiple variables, but most specifically with increasing distance away from the river, what happens to pollinator abundance and diversity. And so some of our sites are close to the river, others are far. And something to note is that some of these locations further away from the river, for example, up here, are pretty close to the foothills. And that, again, will be important when I talk about some of our results. And then we also wanted to look at orchard margin type. So do the margins of these orchards where our transects are located, are they bare or are they vegetated? And that could either be natural vegetation or some other type of vegetation type, whether it be weedy vegetation. We actually do have another treatment where we're actually going to be planting those bare margins as well to see if that improves pollinator abundance and diversity. But I'm not going to be talking about that today. And again, we did look at 3 vegetation types. It's avocado orchards, lemon orchards, and riparian areas. So some of our transects are actually right in the river. And so that's sort of our control to look at what is species diversity in the river relative to the orchards. Okay, so at each of these sites, we run transects through them. The transects are 150 meters long. This is an example of one that's near a river or near the Santa Clara River. We have the 0 meter mark where we place a sampling point. Then at the 75 meter mark, we have another sampling point. And then at, again, 150 meters into the orchard, we have a third sampling point. I'm sorry? A meter is about 3.28 feet. So 100 meters is roughly 300 something feet. Okay, so our sampling is not very technologically advanced, but it works really well. And it's sort of a tried and true method. We call these pan traps, and they're essentially solo dishes that we put out there. Round solo dishes that sort of mimic flowers. And it's surprising how many pollinators, especially bees, do to some degree mistake these and take a dive into the bowls. We have soapy water in those bowls. So once they're flying by, they'll come and a subset of them will land in those bowls. And you notice we have 3 different colors to represent potentially 3 different flower colors. Bees are very visually oriented towards color while foraging. And in the middle is what we call a vein trap. That's a somewhat newer trap that does attract a subset of bee species as well. So that just sort of enhances our ability to collect a diverse subset of bee species. And so once they're in this bowl, we collect them, bring them back into the lab, sort them, remove bycatch, although that bycatch may be important for us. to look at potentially other potential pollinators. And then the long, tedious process of cataloging everything that we find. And so this is something that requires a relative high level of expertise. So Hamutahl has been helping with that, as well as the Cheadle Center up at UC Santa Barbara has a bee taxonomist on board that assists us with this as well. Okay, so these results are very preliminary. Carson sent these over to me this week, so we're sort of in the early stages. We have our second field season. We're going to do a third field season. It takes a long time to catalog and process the bees. So we have 2 years of collection, but this is the first time we're sort of able to process and analyze the data. And so these first slides, this particular slide, I just want to show variability more than anything. So don't worry too much about all of the different colors in a lot of the bars. There's a lot going on here. But each one of these bars, so on the left-hand side here, each one of those bars represents one of our transects along the river. And you can see that there's lots of variability. For example, transect 1 has a high total abundance, so we caught a lot of bees there. Whereas, for example, transect 7, we didn't catch very many bees at that particular one. And on the right-hand side, that just shows species richness. So there's a lot of variability in what we're collecting across these sites. Okay, so the question of does bee abundance and composition differ among the 3 vegetation types we're looking at, so in avocado orchards, lemon orchards, or riparian? And my initial thought was that we'd find really high diversity in riparian areas. We sort of see that in some of our other studies, and it was a little surprising to see that in both terms of abundance on the left-hand side and richness on the right-hand side, we're finding or collecting more bees and more bee species in avocados, and I'll talk a little bit about why that might be. And notice that lemons have the lowest in both abundance and species richness, the number of unique species that we're finding. This slide or this graph shows you essentially the composition of bees at each of the vegetation types. So if you look at avocados, you can see that the total average abundance is higher, as I mentioned on the first slide. But then that relative composition of bee species is different between avocado, lemon, and riparian. And that's important for selecting potentially how you go about enhancing your particular orchard or habitat to support whatever particular bee species might be there in any particular orchard type. And so the names aren't as important. Hamutahl did go over some of these, and I have some photos of them in a few slides. Agapostemon, for example, is pretty high across the board, same as Lasioglossum. And so that would be important. And if you wanted to, for example, improve habitat for Agapostemon, you need to know it's there, and then you can target sort of those habitat requirements for that particular species. So I did want to focus specifically on avocados for a moment, just to show you the results. And so this is the top 6 species that we find in avocado orchards. And so the first one is Serratina, which is the small carpenter bee. And by far, it's the most abundant bee we find generally across the landscape, which was a little surprising. Lasioglossum is another sweat bee, relatively abundant. You notice that honeybee apis is number 5 on the list, so not as abundant as the other species, at least in avocados. And you can see, if you want to see a nice photo of each of these, so I have them ordered, so this is number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Okay, again, there's a lot going on in this figure, and this is sort of where our data analysis is stopped at this point, and we're going to start looking more closely at this. This combines all of those different factors we've been thinking about, whether it's close or far from the river, if it has a bare margin or a vegetated margin. And really the takeaway point I wanted to make here is that we find, so in the top is avocado, the highest bee abundance we have or find is in orchards with vegetated margins that are distant from the river. And that was, again, a little surprising to me. Whereas the lowest abundance is in vegetated orchards with vegetated margins that are close to the river. And I can't really explain that one yet. We need to work on that one a little more. But I will try and describe why we think we're seeing higher abundance both in avocado orchards and in avocado orchards that are further from the river, which is the natural vegetation type. Okay, so do avocados support higher abundance and diversity of pollinators? That's quite possible. But my assumption is that many of the transects or locations we're looking at that are distant from the river are close to the sage scrub. And so sage scrub, we know, has an extremely high diversity of bees. So the likelihood is that a lot of those bees that are foraging in sage scrub are moving into the avocado orchards. So that's contributing to that high level of both pollinator abundance and diversity we see in those particular locations. Why are bee populations so low in lemons? There's a range of reasons. Ben, you probably know some of those, and that's what I think is because they get sprayed so often. So they're relatively sterile environments, unfortunately. Again, this is sort of preliminary data. Hopefully we'll be able to present this again, and Carson can come and present. And along with some of the other researchers who are, for example, installing hedgerows across some of these transects to look at, can we move pollinators deeper into orchards? And if we do place natural vegetation within those orchards, does it improve pollination further from these natural habitats? One thing to note also about riparian is I mentioned that there are two riparian types as well. There's riparian woodlands, which are these really large wind-pollinated trees. It's a really dense canopy. Pollinators do not like that. But then riparian scrub is very similar to this coastal sage scrub. And we do find higher pollinator densities and abundance and richness in those areas as well. And so that might have something to do with why we see the riparian areas having somewhat lower abundance and diversity. Is likely some of our transects are within that really dense canopy, and bees just don't like that. It's cold and dark. Not a great place for them. But one thing we hope to take, one of the major points we hope to take away from this and then be able to provide to growers is what plant species, specifically within scrub environments, promote really high bee diversity. And I think we have a pretty good handle on that. So at all of these sites, we're doing extensive vegetation surveys. So we're going to know the relative composition of plant species. And so, for example, scrub habitats, specifically sage scrub, have a high density of salvia, which is Salvia mellifera, and trying to think of the other one. Common name is sage, sorry. Yeah, so we don't have too much leucophila that's near the river, but up in the foothills, we have lots of mellifera. We do have some leucophila too, but if you look at a sage plant, it has the highest bee diversity of any other particular species that I've seen within the river. And there are lots of other plants up there too that are really attractive to pollinators. So that's something we hope to key in on as well. And we may start looking at that using our vegetation data is trying to pair that with pollinator species abundance and richness and see if any particular plant species key out as important for that. And again, from an ecosystem perspective and as an ecologist, I'd like to see native plants planted because they have those benefits. And if you think of many of our native bee species can be specialists, and they're focusing on a few, either a few plant species or closely related plant species within a particular family. So if you can increase the number of those plant species across the landscape, that's going to benefit orchard production and agriculture in general. So I went over a little bit of this. I just did want to mention Cal Poly is a major cooperator in this project, and Erin Questad is maybe working with some of you to install hedgerows, native plant hedgerows into some of the orchards along these transects. So we'll definitely have much better information for you in the future on how those hedgerows, especially deep within orchards that are not near native vegetation, how they can promote better pollinator abundance and diversity within orchards. But some other potential results from this would be whether or not reducing weedy species would help with improving pollinator abundance in orchards as well, because we do know that many weedy species actually are poor quality in terms of habitat, but also food resources for pollinators. So something we're also interested in. And that's it for this. Thank you very much, and I'll definitely
Thank
take
you,
some.
Lambert. Adam, are there questions for Adam?
No questions, only one request or suggestion for for the research, for your research project. I hope you report details on the time of day and temperatures, humidity, etc., around time of pollen application. Look forward to reading that, as it seems critical to interpreting the results.
Temperature and humidity
How can affect the
affect,
flower?
yeah.
Yep. For example, we have like if I have like a dry condition, the temperature can affect the viability of the pollen. In the tip of the stigma of the flower has some protein. This is a hygroscopic protein. If this protein guide the pollen tube grow to the ovule, and this protein can be affected by the weather. For example, if I have like a dry season, this protein is not more available to the pollen grain. And the humidity is the same, because we need to have like a high humidity, not too strong like a raining season, but we need to have like a high humidity to this pollen grain to germinate it, to go to the ovule, for example.
Are there any questions for the panelists or the speakers today? No? Oh, Rachel, come on down.
So I'm Rachel. We farm avocados between Santa Paula and Fillmore, and we're going to be working with you guys on the trial. But my question was with regards to the length of flowering and the factors that affect that, and whether you have any information on if the duration of the flowering season has any impact on the viability of the flowers and the pollen. So
Does it get worn out?
yeah.
So that the flowers, as a flower opening is only going to be for like 24 or 48 hours, depending on the flower type. But is your question then the flowers at the end of the flowering season better than the flowers at the early of the season? Or vice versa? I can tell, we had a 6-year project at the Derbyshire Ranch over by Oxnard. And I remember one year in particular, we had a very, very early bloom, and we had Hass next to Edinger. And the Edinger and the Hass coincided, and those trees that were right, Roger Essick went out and he called me up because I went out there and I looked, I jumped the fence and I went out and looked, and it's true. The Hass trees next to the Edinger were absolutely dripping with fruit. That particular year was sort of cool, and we had flowers until June. And it ended up at the end of the flowering season, the one pollinizer variety we had in the trial, the Surprise, was still flowering in sync with the Hass. And there we found that the Hass trees next to Surprise were also loaded with fruit. So that would tell me that the quality of the flower is the same. It's the weather opportunities, the ability of that fruit, that flower to open, be pollinated, be fertilized, and be retained on the tree is the difference. Does that make sense?
You had a question for Adam? Maybe. I don't know, I stepped out for a second, but. Were your transects run at what time of year? Or was it once a year? And also, were they on the east or west side of the Santa Clara where the orchards were? And did you see any difference?
Yeah, thanks. That's a good point. The transects where we run them in, we try and time it with the peak of avocado and lemon flowering, which is really difficult because they don't necessarily flower at the same time, and it's hard to get it at the right point. But we have been doing it in May and then again in August, which is after the flowering season, but it sort of gives us a baseline of what the pollinators are doing after that, but generally in May. I think this year we're going to try and do it early. We may do it within a couple of weeks, again in May, and then in August as well. And we have orchards on both sides. We haven't looked at that yet. Sorry about that one. Yeah.
Any other questions? Yo.
Yes, this is an open question. If you have either an overabundance of bees, can that make up for not having any pollinizer plants in the orchard? So I see a lot of, or every orchard just has a different opinion, and I hear a lot of people saying, oh, I don't put pollinators anymore. Pollinizers.
It's a historical question.
It's a great question. It's a very controversial question. And I mean, I've been at the university for 40 years, and I told you the George Goodall, Bud Lee. And here they are, they were in adjoining counties. I think if you go back, and how I explained it to myself was going back to that initial Margaret Sedgley paper and looking at average temperatures in the spring, and Santa Barbara has more, as a general rule, at least it used to have more moderate conditions than Ventura County. And then Ventura County obviously has this huge transect from the coast to all the way to Piru. We're growing avocados. So the environmental conditions are very different. I can tell you we have avocados in the San Joaquin Valley. They behave very differently than Riverside, and the Riverside avocados, same variety, same rootstock, behaves very differently than Irvine. So the environment is super important. And I think perhaps you could get away with no pollinizers or minimal pollinizers if you're sitting along the coast. You have moderate conditions, you have long periods of overlap. But if you're hot and dry, from what I've seen in the San Joaquin Valley, you better have pollinizers or you're not going to have any fruit.
There's one. Where native pollinators are being studied, are cavities or bare ground provided to help the bees have homes?
So sorry. The question was, are they being provided in our study or being assessed, the bare ground?
Are they cavities or bare ground?
Oh, those specific bees. Lasioglossum and Halictus nest in the ground in cavities that I think they make themselves. No, or does it depend on the species? Okay, so the answer is I don't know. But for each one of the species, we do actually have their nesting preferences. I have this like Excel sheet. I just haven't looked at it yet. Like I can't tell you for each one of those species what their actual habitat is.
I can for a couple. Serratina nests generally in the pith of stems, wooden stems. So it's important to keep, standing material for them. A lot of bee species do nest either in the ground, undisturbed ground. So that's important, not just open spaces, but to not disturb those spaces, because then you disturb the nests or the opportunity to make nests. Halictus tripartitus, I believe, is a colonial, so that nests sort of like honeybees but not in a hive per se, but together in cavities and things like that. So all of those structures are really important for native bees. So increasing them, improving them, or not disturbing them either within orchards or around the borders of margins of orchards would be really important.
For pithy stems, those are generally provided by dead trees or bushy vegetation that's allowed to like dry out. That's not always pruned.
Anything else?
Only to say thank you to all our researchers and speakers.
Our next meeting is going to be in Escondido, a Zoom meeting at the Farm Bureau. It's going to be on water, and it's in April. So, Hamutahl, you got to say something. What?
Yeah, I just want to make a quick plug. So Adam mentioned we're part of a research team looking at lots of different types of wildlife. in avocado and lemon farms. So we did the insects, but there's folks studying bats and birds and small mammals and their contribution to pest control. We're having a meeting on February 21st in this room at 9 a.m. So if you want to hear more about those other animals and how they're impacted by natural habitat, we'd love to have you.